The 1918 discovery, a box of death ledger secrets. In the late autumn of 1918, as construction workers were laying the foundation for a new road near Somerset, Kentucky, their shovels struck something solid beneath the frost-bitten soil. What emerged was no ordinary time-worn debris from the past, but a tightly sealed metal box, aged by rust and locked against time. Intrigued, the workers pried it open, revealing a set of 17 leather-bound ledgers, worn but impeccably preserved. As local authorities were called in to examine the find, the initial curiosity rapidly turned into a horror that would send shockwaves through the historical and medical communities alike. Inside those ledgers were detailed handwritten records of the sale of 637 human bodies to medical institutions across the eastern United States, with transactions spanning from 1784 to 1821. Each entry was chilling in its uniformity, names, physical descriptions, destinations, and at the end of each, coffin weighted appropriately. Family none the wiser. It was this eerie final phrase that captured the attention of investigators. It suggested something more sinister than grave robbing. It implied collusion, deception, and the manipulation of mourning families. But most horrifying of all were the 418 entries marked with small red crosses, which investigators later determined indicated individuals who had not died natural deaths, but were instead selected while still alive as specimens for anatomical study. This revelation would reignite a long-dormant investigation into the Ashworth family, a seemingly respectable trio of brothers who had lived in the Kentucky wilderness over a century earlier. Their operation, long buried both literally and metaphorically, was now on the verge of being unearthed in its full grotesque scale. The ledgers offered a portal into a hidden history of exploitation, science, and murder. They detailed not only the quantity of bodies sold, but also their condition, the prices received, and the institutions involved. But perhaps even more disturbing than the transactional records were the reflective notes added by Ezekiel Ashworth, the eldest brother, who documented his role in the affair with clinical pride. This initial discovery set in motion a renewed investigation by the Kentucky Historical Society and independent researchers. Over the following months, scholars and forensic experts would begin the painful process of decoding the ledgers, cross-referencing names, and attempting to reconstruct what had truly occurred over nearly 4 decades in what was once known as Death Valley Cemetery. The box unearthed in 1918 was not just a container of documents. It was a Pandora's box of historical horror, reopening the door to a forgotten American nightmare. Welcome to Death Valley. A cemetery built on betrayal, tucked within the dense pine forests of eastern Kentucky, lies a deceptively serene clearing known as Death Valley, a name that carries far more weight than the blooming wildflowers in spring might suggest. While modern ears might associate the term with desolate landscapes or dramatic natural beauty, this particular valley earned its moniker for far darker reasons. Between the years 1784 and 1821, this secluded 5-acre plot functioned not just as a resting place for the dead, but as the operational heart of one of America's earliest and most disturbing criminal enterprises. Beneath the humble chapel, the neatly arranged gravestones, and the solemn Sunday gatherings, a gruesome secret festered, one that involved the orchestration of over 600 deaths and the sale of their corpses to medical institutions across the eastern United States. What made the crimes committed here so chilling was not merely their number or scope, but the manner in which they were concealed through piety, public service, and the sacred ritual of burial. The Death Valley Cemetery was the creation of the Ashworth brothers, a trio of seemingly virtuous men who each played a distinct and respected role in their growing frontier settlement. Ezekiel, the eldest, was a trained undertaker from Philadelphia. His background in mortuary preparation made him an invaluable asset to a community that had no formal burial practices. Marai, his soft-spoken younger brother, was a master carpenter whose coffin-making skills soon became the local standard. And Zachariah, the youngest and most charismatic, was a Baptist preacher with a gift for words and emotional comfort. Together, they presented a picture of service, stability, and faith-ideal settlers in a remote and rugged land. When they arrived in 1784, they were welcomed with open arms, their ambitions seen as godsend contributions to a settlement that had barely begun to find its footing. But this warm reception masked their true intentions. For while the community saw brothers committed to tending the dead with reverence and ceremony, the Ashworths saw a business opportunity unlike any other one that would exploit the very rituals they performed. By establishing the cemetery themselves, they effectively controlled every stage of the death process: preparation ceremony, burial, and what lay beyond. Their land, situated conveniently near a little-used trade route, allowed for discreet transport of bodies eastward out of the eyes of the isolated local population. The chapel provided a cover for spiritual legitimacy. The coffins crafted by Morai were filled with rocks and sand rather than bodies, and the soft Kentucky soil made for easy digging and easy extraction. This operation flourished under the illusion of religious and social respectability, and for nearly 4 decades, no one in the surrounding settlement suspected a thing. It is this duality, the coexistence of outward holiness and inner horror, that defines the terrifying legacy of Death Valley Cemetery. Families wept openly at funerals, comforted by Zachariah's sermons and Ezekiel's gentle handling of the departed. But as they lowered those weighted coffins into the earth, they were unknowingly participating in a lie of industrial proportions, one that would not come to light until the dead themselves, or what remained of them, began to speak again through the ink of the Ashworth ledgers, hidden for nearly a century beneath the Kentucky soil. The community's faith in the Ashworths' trust ritual and respectability. By the late 1780s, the Ashworth brothers were not just respected, they were revered. The small frontier community of Ashworth Creek, named unofficially after them, saw these men as pillars of moral and spiritual guidance, especially in a landscape where survival often depended on cooperation, tradition, and trust. With limited access to medical care, formal religion, or civic structure, the settlers leaned heavily on the services that the Ashworths offered. Few realized that beneath their well-groomed appearances and carefully cultivated reputations lay a network of deceit as cold as the coffins Marai carved. If anything, the brothers' consistent reliability and solemn mannerisms only strengthened their public persona, making the idea of questioning them seem not only absurd, but downright blasphemous. Ezekiel, the eldest, embodied the somber dignity expected of an undertaker. He worked with quiet precision, never rushing, never cutting corners, always ensuring the deceased were presented with the utmost care during public viewings. His funeral preparations often brought a measure of peace to families dealing with fresh grief. He offered calming explanations, practiced rituals with empathy, and projected a serenity that reassured the bereaved their loved ones were in good hands, even beyond death. In a world where death came frequently, and suddenly such comfort was not merely appreciated, it was essential. Moray, the middle brother, kept to himself, often seen laboring silently in his workshop. He rarely spoke during funerals or town gatherings, but his craftsmanship did all the talking for him. The coffins he created were more than containers, they were works of art. Even the simplest pine models were meticulously constructed, their seams fitted so tightly that no light passed through. Wealthier families were offered ornate options. Polished walnut, hand-carved detailing silver-plated hinges. Moray's precision inspired pride within the community. Parents would tell their children, "When I go, I want a Moray box," as if his coffins were a luxury of their final moments. And then there was Zachariah, the soul of the trio and the most beloved figure in town. Young, handsome, eloquent, and seemingly devout Zachariah had a remarkable talent for speaking directly to the hearts of grieving families. His sermons, though rooted in the familiar texts of Psalms and Revelation, always carried a unique poetic warmth. He made death feel meaningful, not terrifying. He visited the sick, played with children, consoled widows. When someone passed away, Zachariah's presence at the bedside felt like a divine appointment. His homilies on the valley of the shadow of death brought settlers to tears and made them believe truly that the deceased were being guided to eternal peace by hands both earthly and holy. Their seamless integration into daily life was no accident. The Ashworths had deliberately chosen this community after extensive reconnaissance, selecting it not only for its geographic advantages, but for its psychological vulnerability. These were people who needed leaders. The Ashworths provided what they needed: authority, ceremony, consistency. No one thought to question them. No one imagined they could be anything other than what they claimed. After all, who would ever suspect that the very men entrusted to bury the dead might be trading them for profit? And so for nearly a decade the brothers operated without interruption. Funeral after funeral, burial after burial, the community mourned in the open, while the Ashworths concealed the true fate of the bodies, sending them eastward as commodities. With every whispered prayer and folded hand at a grave, the lie deepened, woven not only into the soil of Death Valley Cemetery, but into the very spiritual life of the town that had placed its faith in 3 wolves wearing the garb of shepherd. Laying the foundation for the enterprise geography. Timing and demand. While the Ashworths presented themselves as faithful servants of God and community, their true genius lay not in religion or craft, but in logistics and timing. Long before their arrival in eastern Kentucky, the brothers had studied the frontier, traversing back roads and surveying settlements to find the ideal conditions for what would become a decades-long criminal operation. In Ashworth Creek, they found everything they needed: isolation, growth, and vulnerability. But beyond the local factors, they were also attuned to larger shifts sweeping across the young United States, most notably the rise of formal medical education and the desperate need for human bodies to fuel it. By the mid to late 18th century, American medical schools were rapidly emerging in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, and Boston. These institutions aspired to match the prestige of their European counterparts, which had long emphasized hands-on anatomical study as the foundation of competent surgery and internal medicine. But American law severely restricted access to corpses, typically allowing only the bodies of executed criminals to be dissected. This legal bottleneck created a black market, a shadow economy in which the recently deceased, particularly the poor, the unknown and the unclaimed, became highly valuable commodities. The Ashworths understood this before most. Ezekiel, with his background at Pennsylvania Hospital, had witnessed firsthand the frustration of surgeons and instructors who struggled to teach with only skeletal models or decayed remains. He had overheard their whispered desires, their willingness to pay handsomely for fresh, well-preserved cadavers. He knew the demand was not only real, but growing exponentially. And as the frontier pushed westward with more isolated communities forming, he also realized that the supply of untraceable bodies was increasing. What the cities lacked in legal access, the wilderness could provide in anonymity. Morai, for his part, contributed technical expertise vital to this future trade. During his earlier years working with shipping companies, he had studied preservation methods used to transport food and perishables over long distances. Salt, alcohol, sawdust, and controlled containers, he had seen how goods could survive the journey east. He began modifying these techniques for use on human tissue, developing a crude but effective method of embalming enough to keep a body intact, long enough for it to reach a dissection table hundreds of miles away. And then there was Zachariah, whose role was perhaps the most insidious. His religious credentials weren't merely a tool of spiritual comfort, they were a calculated defense mechanism. In a society where faith and tradition were the cornerstones of community identity, a preacher's words were law. By preaching sermons on mortality, by invoking the language of divine purpose and sacrifice, he set the moral framework that justified their actions, at least in their own minds. "We serve both the living and the dead," Ezekiel would later write in his ledger, a mantra that was echoed throughout their records. Geographically, Ashworth Creek was a gold mine. It sat within 2 days' travel of a seldom-used trade route connecting Kentucky to major eastern cities, yet far enough from any centralized authority to escape scrutiny. The land itself was perfect, elevated to avoid flooding with soft clay-rich soil, ideal for rapid digging and cover-ups. The cemetery's location allowed for discreet nighttime movement, and its remoteness discouraged nosy visitors. To the townsfolk, it was holy ground. To the Ashworths, it was a processing center, a rural depot for the dead. In hindsight, their selection of Ashworth Creek wasn't fate. It was cold, calculated opportunism. They weren't just preparing graves. They were laying the foundation for a lucrative empire of death carefully calibrated to intersect with medicine's hunger, the law's blindness, and a community's unshakable faith in the wrong men. The birth of the operation. How the first deceptions were carried out. The Ashworths' descent into deception did not begin with violence. It began with ritual, a slow and calculated manipulation of grief. The first phase of their enterprise was not marked by bloodshed, but by trust, the sacred trust between a grieving family and those charged with honoring their dead. The brothers understood this power intimately, and they exploited it with unnerving precision. In those early years, the operation was modest, even cautious. The ledgers reveal that in 1784, their first year in Ashworth Creek, only 8 bodies were shipped east. But within these transactions lay the seed of something far more sinister. Whenever a death occurred in the settlement, families would instinctively turn to the Ashworths. Ezekiel, as undertaker, would arrive first cloaked in solemnity and gentle instruction. He would collect the body and bring it to his establishment behind the chapel. There, under the guise of preparing the corpse for viewing, he would begin his assessment. Bodies that had succumbed to contagious disease or were too decomposed were deemed unsuitable and buried as expected. But if the deceased was in good condition, especially young, healthy, or unique in anatomical structure, the brothers would pivot to their secret protocol. Once the family had said their goodbyes during the public viewing, Ezekiel would request privacy to perform final preparations. The coffin lid would be temporarily closed. The mourners, trusting in his professionalism, would leave. It was then that the real work began. Ezekiel would access a hidden trapdoor beneath the embalming table, leading to a cool, low-ceilinged cellar cut into the Kentucky clay. There he would begin preservation procedures, injecting a solution of alcohol brine and a blend of herbs into the body's major vessels, a crude but effective form of arterial embalming. Meanwhile, Morai would fill the coffin above with a blend of rocks, sand, and in winter, frozen soil, carefully measured to replicate the weight of a human body. Burial linens were wrapped around the contents to maintain the illusion. Once sealed, the coffin would be returned for the funeral ceremony, and no one suspected a thing. Zachariah, as preacher, performed his role flawlessly. His sermons were rich with imagery of eternal rest and resurrection, his voice often trembling with emotion as he invoked the hope of heaven. He stood over coffins he knew were filled with stones and earth, offering prayers that moved even the most hardened frontiersmen to tears. In one early case, Martha Tunney, a recent widow, told neighbors, "Zachariah's words gave me peace. It's like Henry was already walking with the Lord." Little did she know her husband's body would be on its way to Philadelphia within 48 hours. The shipping process was equally discreet. Merchants traveling east would be paid to carry sealed crates, believing they contained tools or preserved meats. These crates, built by Morai to resemble tool chests, were narrow, reinforced, and packed with sawdust to absorb any leakage or odor. Payment would arrive weeks later in hidden compartments of returning wagons, or sometimes in notes passed through local shopkeepers. The brothers kept meticulous records noting amounts, body characteristics, and institutional requests. In April 1785, Ezekiel wrote, "Received payment for subject number 8, $23. Dr. H requests future specimens show healed fractures. Must observe more carefully." These were not the actions of desperate men. They were the cold, deliberate choices of entrepreneurs operating in the shadows of the sacred. There were no graves robbed, no coffins disturbed after burial. Instead, the deception occurred in plain sight, with the community's full participation, unwitting but complete. The funerals were real. The mourning was sincere, but the bodies had already left the valley, carried not by angels, but by commerce. A business grows, scaling the trade and perfecting the process. 1787, 1790. By 1787, just 3 years after the Ashworths' arrival, their covert operation had proven not only viable, but exceptionally profitable. What began as an occasional deception had transformed into a systematic business model, one that they now sought to scale with precision and confidence. That year, the brothers made several significant changes that expanded their reach and further entrenched their deception within the fabric of community life. From land acquisitions to preservation, improvements from coded communication to selective outreach, the Ashworths evolved from undertakers into industrialists of the dead, trading human bodies with the quiet efficiency of seasoned logisticians. The first major step in scaling their trade was geographic expansion. In 1787, the brothers purchased adjacent acreage east of Death Valley Cemetery, extending the grounds and building a road that connected more directly with the obscure but vital trade routes leading toward Virginia and Pennsylvania. This road, designed with slight curves to mimic natural footpaths, allowed wagon traffic to enter and leave the property without drawing attention. The expansion also enabled the Ashworths to offer services to other settlements, sometimes traveling up to 20 miles to retrieve and prepare bodies. These external funerals became an ideal front for new acquisitions, offering access to non-local corpses who crucially had no family members nearby to question burial arrangements. Morai Ever the craftsman refined his preservation containers. Earlier tool chest models gave way to longer, more stable wooden crates lined with cloth and sawdust sealed with pitch to prevent odor. He also developed an improved solution that preserved tissue more effectively, incorporating camphor and powdered alum knowledge he likely gathered from imported medical texts or hearsay from traveling apothecaries. These innovations enabled longer transport durations, which meant the brothers could now fulfill orders from cities farther afield, including Boston and Charleston. Meanwhile, Zachariah began organizing community events that further embedded the Ashworths into the emotional life of Ashworth Creek. Twice a year, he held cemetery cleanup days where families would gather to plant flowers, repair headstones, and share meals among the graves. These gatherings, which might have seemed macabre to outsiders, served as emotional rituals for the frontier community. They reinforced the idea that Death Valley Cemetery was a sacred, well-tended place, a reflection of both spiritual devotion and civic pride. Ironically, these events often occurred just yards above the hidden cellar where corpses were preserved for sale. Ezekiel's ledger entries from this time reflect a growing professionalism in their criminal enterprise. In early 1788, he noted, "Subject of 19 retrieved from Pine Hollow. Strong preservation, shipped to Dr. S. of Baltimore with new packaging. Payment pending, $21. Zachariah notes a rise in influenza, anticipate higher death count this spring. It is this kind of logistical foresight blended with spiritual manipulation that allowed their business to flourish unnoticed. He tracked death rates. He tracked community illness. He tracked weather conditions, even economic patterns that might affect shipment volume or merchant availability. They also established a coded language for correspondence. Letters to medical contacts would refer to corpses as agricultural goods or green harvests, and specific requests for specimens would be cloaked in terms like straight-grain ideal anatomy or knotted timber bodies with tumors or unique features. This code reduced the risk of exposure even if letters were intercepted. They weren't just body traders anymore. They were black market suppliers in an underground anatomical supply chain that reached across 6 states. By 1790, their annual shipments had more than doubled. That year alone, they exported 15 bodies each, earning between $20 and $30 a fortune in a frontier economy, where a skilled laborer earned less than $1 a day. Yet despite the growing wealth, the Ashworth remained modest in appearance, reinvesting profits into their infrastructure and purchasing land under false names across eastern Kentucky. The brothers weren't content to survive. They were building a quiet empire, forged in soil, sustained by secrecy, and sealed with the tears of trusting mourners who believed the Ashworth were burying the dead, when in truth they were selling them to science. The shift toward murder, when business demanded more than the dead could supply, 1791. By 1791, the Ashworth operation had reached a grim threshold. The stream of naturally deceased individuals, those who died of illness, age or accident, was no longer sufficient to satisfy the growing hunger of medical institutions on the East Coast. Requests had become more frequent, more specific, and more lucrative. The brothers found themselves at a crossroads. Would they continue to wait passively for death to arrive? Or would they embrace a darker evolution, one where death could be orchestrated? The catalyst came in the form of a letter from Dr. William Hammond of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, delivered by a traveling merchant who had long served as a courier for the brothers' preserved shipments. Written in coded language, the letter expressed increasing desperation. Legal reforms had tightened the already limited supply of cadavers for medical study, and demand was ballooning as more students enrolled and more universities opened. Dr. Hammond offered $40 per suitable subject, with bonuses for bodies that met specific anatomical conditions. In today's terms, this was the equivalent of several $1,000s per corpse. Ezekiel's ledger from October 17, 1791, records his reaction. $40 per subject changes our calculations entirely. At such rates, we need not wait for death to visit Ashworth Creek. This entry marks the moment when the Ashworths moved from passive opportunists to active murderers. Their first victim was a nameless traveler, a solitary man who sought shelter from an autumn storm at the chapel near Death Valley Cemetery. Zachariah, ever the gracious host, invited him to dinner. The man was welcomed into the Ashworth home, offered food, drink, and rest, but his wine was laced with a concoction Ezekiel had perfected during his time at Pennsylvania Hospital, a mixture of belladonna opium and herbs that induced unconsciousness, followed by respiratory failure, mimicking a peaceful natural death. Ezekiel documented the result clinically. Subject NAFI 3, male approx. 30, robust physique, noted surgical scar across abdomen. No identification, administered solution at dinner. Death appeared painless. Preservation begun within the hour. From that moment forward, murder became a standard tool of their trade. The brothers developed a careful victim profile, men traveling alone, moving westward in search of land or work without family nearby, or detailed itineraries. These individuals would not be missed. They were easy to charm, easy to house, and easy to dispose of. Zachariah engaged them first, often during Sunday services or roadside encounters, subtly probing for personal details, where they came from, whether they had kin, how long they intended to stay. If the answers aligned with their criteria, Ezekiel prepared the necessary treatment, and Morai cleared space in the cellar. Their facility expanded too. Morai redesigned the basement beneath their embalming room to include 3 separate chambers, allowing them to process multiple corpses simultaneously during busy travel seasons. They refined their poison further, using compounds that decomposed quickly and left little trace even if an examination occurred, a rare possibility in their remote frontier settlement. Even the victims' belongings were handled strategically. Personal effects were burned or traded in distant towns to prevent identification. Horses were sold through intermediaries. Any valuables that might tie the deceased to Ashworth Creek were erased. The deaths were made to look like robberies, accidents, or disappearances along the treacherous mountain roads. By the end of 1795, the brothers had shipped 28 bodies, 19 of which were confirmed murders. The profits exceeded $100 in that year, alone a staggering sum. But it wasn't just about the money. The Ashworths now saw themselves as something greater than grave robbers or even killers. In Ezekiel's words, we do God's work in a different register. The dead teach the living. What is one man's death compared to knowledge that may save thousands? It was a logic rooted in utilitarianism and sealed in blood, a cold, calculated justification for industrial-scale murder, veiled in science, sealed in pine and sanctified from the pulpit. A web of complicity doctors, judges, professors, and the rise of a criminal network. 1796, 1800. As the Ashworth operation deepened its descent into calculated murder, a new and equally disturbing layer began to form. Around it, a web of willing collaborators stretching far beyond the pine woods of eastern Kentucky. No longer was this merely the story of three brothers committing crimes in secret. By the close of the 18th century, the Ashworths had cultivated a criminal network that included medical professors, physicians, judges, sheriffs, legislators, and even stagecoach drivers, each with their own stake in the growing economy of human dissection. What had begun as a hidden trade in cadavers was now a systematized enterprise rooted in corruption, fueled by scientific demand, and protected by those in power. Ezekiel's ledger from 1797 provides a chilling glimpse into how far the network had grown. One entry notes a particularly valuable ally. Dr. M. of Baltimore College proves indispensable. His cousin, a magistrate in Harford County, ensures passage of our wagons without inspection. In exchange, we provide 2 specimens monthly preference for female subjects. This brief notation reveals volumes. The Ashworths were no longer merely sneaking bodies through the cracks of legal oversight. They were now escorted by it, aided by officials who turned a blind eye in exchange for anatomical currency or political favors. The specificity of requests also increased dramatically during this time. No longer content with fresh or whole corpses, medical schools began placing bespoke orders, muscular young men to study ligament structure, elderly women with signs of degenerative disease, children with congenital abnormalities. Some even asked for bodies displaying rare pathologies, advanced tuberculosis, healed fractures, amputations, or tumors. The Ashworths, ever eager to please and expand their clientele, began tailoring their murders accordingly. Victims were not chosen by chance, but by academic utility. They were farmed not merely for death, but for educational potential. To facilitate this precision, the brothers relied on an ever-evolving coded correspondence system. In letters, bodies were referred to as stock goods or timber, with specific traits cloaked in lumber or agricultural terminology. A healthy male corpse was labeled straight grain, while a body with abnormalities might be referred to as knotted wood. Children were saplings. Female bodies were fertile plots. In a disturbing turn, some letters even referenced expected dissection outcomes and lesson plans, such as request subject demonstrating pelvic dimensions suitable for midwifery class urgent need. To keep up with rising demand, the brothers expanded their preservation capabilities. Morai constructed a larger cellar complete with improved ventilation and drainage systems. They added false bottom wagons to smuggle bodies east with even greater efficiency. Meanwhile, they strategically built relationships with traveling merchants offering generous pay to carry sealed crates labeled as preserved agricultural goods. These middlemen, often illiterate or simply indifferent, asked no questions. With their increased earnings, now thousands of dollars annually, the brothers began investing in land and businesses throughout Kentucky, often through proxies or false identities. They remained personally modest, understanding that wealth would invite questions. But behind closed doors, they had become among the wealthiest men in the region, using death as currency and institutional demand as justification. The true horror of this period, however, is not just that the Ashworths killed with impunity, but that they did not act alone. They were facilitated, protected, and rewarded by individuals and institutions that should have served justice, healing, and truth. The line between science and savagery blurred. And while the Ashworths held the scalpel, others held the lamp and watched quietly, their silence purchased in flesh. By 1800, the brothers had moved from local undertakers to national suppliers embedded in a corrupt system that saw the dissection of the poor and unconnected not as a crime, but as progress. What started in a pine-covered cemetery had metastasized into a network of complicity, one that would span 6 states, reach across oceans, and touch the very halls of early American medicine. Zachariah's traveling ministry, expanding the hunting grounds, 1800 to 1810. As the new century dawned, the Ashworth operation entered its most audacious phase. With demand for anatomical specimens surging and competition from rival suppliers emerging in urban centers, the brothers turned to an unthinkable strategy, expanding their hunting grounds beyond Ashworth Creek. The key to this next evolution was not Ezekiel's medical cunning or Morai's preservation techniques, but Zachariah's charisma. Having spent nearly 2 decades cultivating his reputation as a trusted man of God, Zachariah now leveraged his spiritual stature to preach in nearby settlements. But these sermons were no longer just about faith. They were reconnaissance missions carefully crafted to identify new victims and new communities for infiltration. Between 1800 and 1810, Zachariah regularly traveled to neighboring counties under the guise of a visiting preacher, delivering passionate homilies and offering to conduct baptisms, funerals, and pastoral care. His sermons drew crowds, particularly in rural towns that lacked ordained ministers. With his Virginia seminary training and silver tongue, Zachariah was often welcomed as a spiritual savior. What few realized, however, was that each of these trips served a second, darker purpose: to locate the elderly, the infirm, the recently arrived, or those living without family or community ties. These were the ideal targets, men and women whose disappearances would not provoke alarm. When Zachariah identified a potential subject, he returned to Ashworth Creek and presented Ezekiel as a traveling doctor capable of offering treatments unavailable in the region. These treatments, of course, were nothing more than an extension of their old method, a potent herbal mixture administered with warmth and prayer that induced death within hours, often mimicking fever, stroke, or fatigue. In August 1801, Ezekiel recorded, "Acquired 3 subjects from Logan Creek this month." Zachariah's position as preacher continues to open doors. People trust the man who brings a doctor to their bedside. Their faith is touching if misplaced. The brothers' boldness increased with each success. While earlier victims were often anonymous travelers by the mid-1800s, they began targeting better integrated individuals, especially when medical schools offered high premiums for certain anatomical traits. Young women of childbearing age, elderly men with degenerative disease, even children with rare deformities. All were requested, all were provided. In such cases, the Ashworths ensured the cause of death appeared natural or accidental. They staged drownings, fabricated sudden illnesses, and even pushed individuals from horses, presenting the resulting trauma as unfortunate misfortune. The more specific the request, the more carefully choreographed the death. During this period, Morai modified the cellar once again, creating 3 processing chambers, allowing for greater throughput of corpses, especially during travel season when the roads were open and wagon movement attracted little notice. The brothers could now receive, kill, preserve, and dispatch a body within 48 hours. Their system functioned like a well-oiled machine, a grim production line of death operating beneath a chapel of worship. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this decade was the way in which Zachariah's popularity only grew even as the body count climbed. His congregation swelled as word of his sermon spread. People traveled for miles to hear him speak about mortality, resurrection, and divine justice. Ironically, the very themes that cloak the crimes he orchestrated. He preached over empty coffins. He wept with grieving families. He laid his hands on children while plotting their fate. His role was not just that of a preacher, it was that of a hunter in shepherd's robes. In 1804, Ezekiel documented a rare personal reflection from Zachariah in the ledger 20 Years in This Community. They look to us for guidance on how to die well. If they only knew we have become the most practiced shepherds of souls to the afterlife in all of Kentucky. It was not merely murder. It was murder wrapped in trust ritual and theological eloquence. The community had not just failed to see through the Ashworths, it had helped build the stage upon which they performed, never suspecting that beneath the polished wood of the pulpit and the damp soil of the cemetery lay 1,000 silent screams embalmed and exported in crates labeled as mercy. Cracks in the coffin, suspicion, slips and close calls. 1805-1810. By the middle of the first decade of the 19th century, the Ashworth brothers had become masters of concealment, orchestrating murder and corpse trafficking beneath the cloak of religious service and civic duty. But even the most carefully constructed deceptions eventually begin to fray at the edges. Between 1805 and 1810, a series of incidents signaled the first true cracks in their otherwise flawless facade moments of vulnerability that, though not fatal to their enterprise at the time, hinted at the growing risk of exposure. These years tested the brothers' adaptability and control, revealing how the pressure of scale ambition and an increasingly interconnected world threatened to unravel their secrets. The first major breach came in the spring of 1805 when a traveling merchant en route to Richmond noticed something peculiar about the sealed crate he had been paid to transport. A foul odor began to leak through the pitch-lined wood midway through his journey, far stronger than the preserved agricultural goods he had been told he was carrying. Suspicious, he brought the matter up to Morai upon his return to Ashworth Creek. In response, Morai invited the man to dinner, cordial, apologetic, and warm. He never left that dinner table alive. Days later, Ezekiel's ledger entry noted subject number 283, mail approx. 40 merchant, disposed of due to breach of discretion. No further transport via this route recommended. Though the situation was contained, it revealed a significant liability in the brothers' system. With more shipments and wider outreach, they were increasingly reliant on third parties who, however unwitting, could stumble upon the truth. From that point forward, the Ashworths shifted many of their transports to trusted couriers or used false bottom wagons driven by operatives trained in silence. They also refined their preservation solution, once again ensuring bodies remained odorless for longer periods. But danger did not always come from outside. In 1807, a new figure arrived in Ashworth Creek, Dr. Thomas Bennett, a young physician trained in Philadelphia, hoping to establish a practice in the growing settlement. With his professional background and academic mindset, Dr. Bennett soon noticed something that few others had dared to question: the unusual number of traveler deaths in such a small, remote town. He began asking around about burial records, causes of death, who performed the funerals. His inquiries reached the ears of Ezekiel, and his fate was sealed. Just 3 months after his arrival, Dr. Bennett died suddenly, the cause announced by Zachariah as brain fever, a broad catch-all term that conveniently masked poison-induced neurological shutdown. His funeral was handled swiftly, and in a rare break from routine, his body was actually interred in Death Valley Cemetery rather than shipped. This was a strategic decision. An empty coffin for a local doctor might have raised too many questions if later examined. The ledger entry, however, leaves no doubt: subject unshipped. Public burial required. Risk too great. Despite these incidents, the brothers' confidence grew, perhaps dangerously so. With nearly 300 confirmed victims by 1810 and hundreds more in the years to come, they had weathered storms that would have sunk lesser criminals. They had bribed officials, silenced witnesses, and outlived scrutiny. Yet the expanding size of their operation made control more tenuous. More intermediaries meant more people who might ask the wrong questions. More victims meant more chance for overlap, misidentification, or family pursuit. Still, for all their paranoia, the brothers remained calm. To the townsfolk, nothing had changed. Zachariah's sermons continued to draw crowds. Ezekiel consulted on cemetery expansions. Mahai trained apprentices in coffin-making, none of whom ever learned the true purpose of the cellar beneath the embalming house. But the clock had started ticking. The brothers didn't know it yet, but each close call was a fissure in the tomb they had built around their truth. And eventually someone persistent, grieving, and unafraid, would come along to crack it open. Elizabeth Caldwell's arrival, a widow's questions that changed everything. 1820, 1821. It was a cold autumn in 1820 when the Ashworth brothers' carefully constructed empire of death began to unravel, not by lawmen or scholars, but by the relentless determination of a grieving widow named Elizabeth Caldwell. For nearly 4 decades, the Ashworths had operated without consequence, murdering, preserving, and shipping human bodies like goods in a well-oiled industrial operation. But in Elizabeth, they met something they had not prepared for: a woman with intellect, resolve, and an unshakable instinct that something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth's husband, James Caldwell, a well-to-do farmer from central Kentucky, had passed through Ashworth Creek in early October on his way to visit relatives in Virginia. He stopped, as many did, to attend Sunday service at the cemetery chapel, where Zachariah Ashworth welcomed him with warmth and hospitality. According to the ledger entry for September 24th, 1820, Ezekiel had taken note. Potential subject presented himself today. J. Caldwell, traveling alone to Virginia. Well-dressed, approx. 45, excellent physical condition. Zachariah suggests we wait for return journey, when his absence would be attributed to dangers of Virginia Road rather than our community. And so they waited. When James returned through the town 2 weeks later, he once again attended service, spoke with Zachariah, and accepted an invitation to dine with the brothers. He never left. According to Ezekiel's clinical entry, James Caldwell became victim number 623, selected for his health discretion and presumed anonymity. But what the Ashworths hadn't counted on was Elizabeth. Unlike many of their previous victims, solitary travelers without close ties, James had someone waiting for him. Elizabeth, 20 years his junior, was recently married, fiercely intelligent and well acquainted with her husband's habits. When he failed to return home by October 15th, she did not accept the vague explanations often used to placate the families of the missing. She began to retrace his steps, sending letters to postmasters and inns along his intended route, documenting every response in a small leather journal. In early November, she received confirmation that James had been seen in Ashworth Creek, specifically at the cemetery chapel, on October 9th. Without hesitation, she traveled there herself. Upon arrival on November 20th, Elizabeth introduced herself to Zachariah and calmly inquired about her husband. Zachariah, ever composed, feigned sympathy. He acknowledged James had dined with them, but claimed he left at dusk, heading east on horseback. A good Christian man, he said. Spoke fondly of his new wife. We were concerned about him traveling so late, but he was determined to press on. It might have worked had Morai not faltered. As Elizabeth entered the chapel, Morai was nearby. Upon hearing her name, his face reportedly drained of color. The subtle but unmistakable reaction planted a seed of suspicion that Elizabeth could not ignore. She remained in town, renting a room at the local inn, and began quietly interviewing locals. She asked thoughtful, specific questions and noted every detail. Her presence was polite, respectful, but unyielding. Ezekiel's ledger began to reflect concern. Mrs. Caldwell remains in the settlement, asking questions about her husband's passage. Zachariah has provided consistent detail. Morai's unease is problematic. Have instructed him to avoid the woman entirely. But it was too late. Elizabeth had already uncovered a critical inconsistency. A young boy playing near the road behind the Ashworth home on the night of October 9th mentioned seeing James Caldwell's chestnut horse still tied near the house, well after dark, contradicting Zachariah's account of his early departure. When confronted, Zachariah calmly explained that James had briefly returned, having forgotten his gloves. But Elizabeth knew that couldn't be true. James was meticulous. The gloves were custom-made and always stored in his saddlebags. This wasn't a forgetful husband. This was a fabricated cover story. What began as a wife seeking closure was now an investigation. Elizabeth had come to bury her husband. She would instead unearth a nightmare that the forest and the Ashworths had buried for nearly 40 years. The graves that spoke exhumation. Exposure and the beginning of the end, December 1821. In the chill of early December 1821, the soil of Death Valley Cemetery was no longer a place of peace. It was about to become the stage for one of the most chilling revelations in early American history. Elizabeth Caldwell, no longer content with polite inquiry, took her suspicions to Magistrate Jacob Turner, the nearest authority figure in Ashworth Creek. Initially, Turner was dismissive. After all, the Ashworth brothers had served the community faithfully for decades. Who would dare suspect them of wrongdoing, much less murder? But Elizabeth, with her detailed journal, composed demeanor, and unrelenting logic, planted a seed of doubt Turner couldn't shake. After a cordial visit to the Ashworth home, where he brought up Elizabeth's concerns in passing, Turner recorded nothing amiss. The brothers remained calm, their story unwavering. But Ezekiel's ledger told a different tale. Turner's visit signals potential danger. Mrs. Caldwell has involved local authority, must accelerate shipment preparations and suspend new acquisitions. Zachariah suggests contingency protocols. Fire may become necessary. What the Ashworths could not anticipate was Elizabeth's next move, one based not on legal leverage, but on intuition cloaked in emotion. On December 3rd, Elizabeth returned to Turner with a chilling request. "I've had a troubling dream," she said. "My husband calls to me from this place. For my peace of mind, I wish to have recent traveler graves opened to assure myself he is not here, misidentified perhaps, or buried without my knowledge." It was a devastatingly clever approach. If she had demanded exhumation based purely on suspicion, she might have been refused. But by framing her appeal as an act of grief, of spiritual closure, she won over not only Turner, but members of the community, including Martha Tunney, one of the oldest residents. "If it would ease the poor woman's heart," Martha said at a community gathering. "Christian charity demands we help her. I would want the same comfort if I were searching for my Henry." Turner reluctantly agreed. On December 7th, in the grey morning light, a group of townspeople, Elizabeth Turner and a visibly shaken Morai, gathered at the traveller section of the cemetery. The grave marked Jonathan Wyde. September 1820 was the first to be opened. As the earth was removed and the coffin raised, a heavy silence fell. Morai hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside was not a body, but a carefully arranged bundle of rocks, sand, and burial linens, shaped to mimic human weight and form. The crowd gasped. Murmurs rose. Elizabeth's face remained stoic. She turned to Turner and simply said, "Open the others." 2 more graves were excavated, 2 more coffins, 2 more hollow deceptions. Turner, visibly shaken, confronted the Ashworths. "What is the meaning of this?" Zachariah tried to claim grave robbers, suggesting that perhaps body snatchers had stolen the corpses and replaced the contents to avoid detection. But Elizabeth struck back with ruthless logic. Why would robbers refill coffins with rocks and rebury them, and how could they dig in your cemetery without notice? The community's trust, once the Ashworth's greatest weapon, fractured in real time. Turner ordered the brothers confined to their home, not only for investigation, but also for their own protection from the rising anger of neighbors. 2 armed men were posted at the door. Inside their home, the brothers panicked. Ezekiel wrote his final ledger entry that evening. "All is lost. The woman's persistence has undone decades of work. We have prepared for this. Essential records and funds secured. Fire will cleanse. The work must continue elsewhere." That night, under the cover of darkness and a staged house fire, the Ashworth brothers vanished into the winter woods, leaving behind only smoke, suspicion, and a hellish secret buried below. But the fire, meant to destroy the evidence, instead revealed everything: the secret cellar discovery of the chamber of death and the ledgers of horror. As the fire blazed through the Ashworth property on the night of December 7, 1821, it was meant to be the final act in a play the brothers had written and directed for nearly 4 decades, a curtain of smoke to conceal the systematic horror beneath their home. But in a poetic twist of fate, it was the fire itself that revealed the full scale of their crimes. When townspeople arrived to battle the flames, they weren't simply trying to save a home. They were unknowingly about to unearth one of the darkest secrets in early American history. As embers cooled and morning light touched the scorched foundations, a group of townsfolk discovered a large charred beam had collapsed into the floor behind the funeral chapel. Beneath the rubble, obscured by smoke and soot, was a trap door previously concealed beneath Ezekiel's embalming table. Morai had built it seamlessly into the floor, its hinges hidden, the handle recessed. Now it gaped open like a wound in the earth, and what lay below would forever change the way the community understood their dead. The steps descended into a subterranean chamber carved into the clay beneath the property. It was larger than anyone imagined, 3 separate rooms, each with its own horrors. In the first chamber, officials discovered surgical tools, jars of preservative chemicals, iron hooks, bone saws, and wax-sealed containers marked with anatomical diagrams. There were tables stained dark with age, the scent of alcohol brine, and something more organic, something unmistakably human still hanging in the damp air. The second chamber held 5 bodies in varying stages of preservation. Most were wrapped tightly in linen heads, uncovered, revealing waxy faces with hollowed features. One was immediately identifiable, James Caldwell, Elizabeth's husband. Still on his finger was the gold wedding band she had described so clearly to Magistrate Turner. His features, though pale and drained, were unmistakably intact. In that moment, Elizabeth's grief turned to a quiet, terrible affirmation. "I knew my husband was here," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "A wife knows when she's being lied to about the man she loves." But it was the third chamber that held the most damning evidence. Lined neatly on wooden shelves were 16 leather-bound ledgers, their covers blackened but intact, each labeled chronologically. These were the Ashworth records, an unbroken archive of names, dates, locations, anatomical details, prices, and buyers. The entries stretched from 1784 to 1821 with clinical precision. But these were not just transaction logs. Scattered among them were notes in Ezekiel's hand, philosophical justifications, supplier codes, and chilling reflections. The dead serve the living. Their families need not know the higher purpose their bodies now fulfill. In a small iron box tucked beside the ledgers was a bundle of correspondence letters from doctors, professors, and officials across 6 states, many written in coded language, but unmistakably transactional. Requests for subjects of a certain age, weight, gender. Instructions for transport, payment receipts, even letters from European anatomists in Edinburgh and Paris praising the quality of preservation. The discovery made headlines in Lexington and rippled as far as Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, where shocked medical institutions began scrambling to distance themselves from names found in the ledgers. A task force was assembled to cross-reference ledger entries with missing persons, reports unmarked graves, and suspicious deaths across the Appalachian frontier. The cellar that had served as a cold-efficient center for a profitable murder trade had now become a monument of accusation. It exposed not just the Ashworth brothers, but the rotting ethical core of a system that had allowed their crimes to flourish. What had been hidden beneath the soil for 40 years was now fully illuminated not by divine light, but by the hellish glow of their own fire. And in that cellar, history found its voice not carved in stone, but written in blood and ink. Shockwaves through medicine and law, the aftermath of a century's greatest betrayal. The revelations unearthed in that burnt cellar did more than just shock a grieving community. They shattered the moral foundations of early American medicine and exposed a nationwide system of complicity, silence, and rationalized horror. What began as a localized investigation into the disappearance of one man quickly transformed into one of the largest criminal inquiries in the history of the early republic. The Ashworth case would not only uncover mass murder, but would force a reckoning with the very institutions that claimed to serve the public good. Within days of the seller's discovery, riders were dispatched to Lexington, Louisville, and beyond, summoning county and state officials, medical examiners, and legal scholars. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no need for speculation. The ledgers themselves, painstakingly preserved, laid out the transactions in full detail: names, conditions, destinations, payments, even anatomical notes. The number that emerged from the initial audit stunned even the most seasoned investigators. 637 confirmed victims over 37 years. Not only had the Ashworth brothers become America's most prolific murderers to date, they had done so with the full participation of people in positions of power. The final ledger listed 43 individuals, physicians, professors, judges, magistrates who had knowingly purchased bodies, submitted special orders, or facilitated transport across state lines. Some had requested female subjects of childbearing age. Others had sought children with congenital deformities. These were not distant figures hiding in shadows. They were men shaping the medical education of the next generation, standing at the front of lecture halls, dissecting the dead obtained through betrayal. As the names became public, chaos erupted across the academic world. Medical colleges issued panicked denials. Some professors resigned overnight, others fled to Europe. One letter from the College of Physicians in Baltimore to the governor of Kentucky read, "We categorically condemn the actions of the Ashworth brothers and disavow any knowledge of the criminal nature of their enterprise." But the ledgers told a different story, one in which orders were placed, payments were made, and questions were never asked. Back in Ashworth Creek, soon to be renamed Providence, the psychological toll was incalculable. Families who had trusted the Ashworths to bury their loved ones were now told their relatives had likely been shipped in crates and cut apart on distant tables. Martha Tunney, who had spoken so movingly of Zachariah's sermon at her husband's funeral in 1785, discovered that his body had never been in the coffin. He had been shipped to Philadelphia 2 days after the service. For 36 years, she told the Lexington Gazette, "I have brought flowers to an empty grave." The legal system, too, was forced into reflection. In 1822 and 1823, multiple state legislatures passed laws aimed at tightening control over anatomical specimens, restricting dissection to executed criminals, and requiring public oversight of all cadaver acquisitions. But the black market endured because the demand remained high, and the means to satisfy it had already been normalized. Even with new laws, loopholes persisted. Bodies continued to disappear. The Ashworths may have been exceptional in scope, but not in spirit. They were merely the most efficient agents of a system built on human disposability. The investigation into their co-conspirators led to limited justice. Of the 43 named in the final ledger, only 11 faced charges, and just 4 were convicted, most serving less than 5 years. Those with wealth or influence evaded prosecution, many vanishing into the anonymity of the growing frontier or sailing to Europe under false names. And the Ashworth brothers, themselves, gone. Despite an extensive manhunt that stretched from Kentucky to Missouri to Canada, they were never found. Rumors abounded: a trio of preachers setting up camp in the Ozarks, an undertaker named Ashfield in Pennsylvania, whose preservation methods seemed suspiciously advanced, a Dr. Thomas Blackwood in Tennessee with Zachariah's same build and silver tongue. But none were confirmed. Like smoke, the Ashworths had slipped through the fingers of justice, leaving behind only ashes records and wounds that would never fully heal. Yet in their absence, the questions remained. How many others like them existed? How many more had died unnoticed in the name of science? And what happens when those we trust most, our pastors, our healers, our caretakers of the dead, turn out to be the very architects of our ruin, a nation reckons? Burial practices, cultural trauma, and the legacy of the Ashworth case. In the years that followed the Ashworth revelations, America entered a period of quiet reckoning, a national pause shaped not only by legal reforms, but by a deeper, more intimate wound, the erosion of trust in death itself. For nearly 4 decades, the Ashworth brothers had hidden their crimes beneath the rituals of mourning behind scripture and solemn craftsmanship. And when the full scale of their betrayal came to light, it did more than provoke outrage. It triggered a profound cultural trauma, forcing communities to re-examine the very customs by which they honored their dead. Nowhere was this reckoning felt more keenly than in the Appalachian region. Communities that had once leaned heavily on local undertakers and preachers began instituting vigilant burial customs. One of the most widespread practices to emerge was the multi-day wake during which the deceased's body would never be left unattended. Families and neighbors took turns keeping vigil, not just out of grief, but out of fear that the body might be tampered with, stolen, or substituted. The tradition of sitting up with the dead, once a gesture of honor, took on a more defensive posture, born from the haunting knowledge that even a sealed coffin might be filled with stones. In some towns, burial societies were formed, grassroots organizations composed of community members whose sole responsibility was to oversee every aspect of the burial process. These groups insisted on open coffin viewings, independent grave digging, and the physical sealing of caskets only in the presence of multiple witnesses. Elsewhere, it became customary to watch the grave itself for several days, post-burial guarding against potential exhumation and ensuring no one could revisit the earth for purposes other than remembrance. The name Ashworth became a byword for betrayal. In sermons and schoolhouses, the tale of the brothers was retold not merely as a cautionary tale, but as a moral warning that evil does not always arrive in monstrous form. Sometimes it comes dressed in a preacher's collar, speaking scripture with tears in its eyes. Sometimes it smiles while hammering the final nail into a coffin it knows to be empty. Back in Ashworth Creek, the transformation was equally symbolic and physical. The town officially changed its name to Providence in 1823, as if severing itself from the past might somehow loosen the grip of memory. But memory clung like ivy. Death Valley Cemetery was deconsecrated, its grounds largely abandoned, and families who could afford it exhumed their loved ones, often discovering the same sickening deception, coffins filled with nothing but rocks, frozen dirt, and sawdust. The only permanent structure left was the mass grave marker erected by officials to honor the unidentified victims whose remains were discovered in the cellar and around the property. It read with grim finality, "Here lie the victims of man's inhumanity to man." 1784, 1821. Yet the deepest scars were not physical, they were spiritual. The people who had wept alongside Zechariah at funerals, who had praised Ezekiel's care for the departed, who had admired Marai's precision, were now forced to confront an unbearable truth. They had trusted murderers not for months, but for decades. Their grief had been staged, their faith weaponized, their dead sold. It was not just a failure of oversight, but a violation of the most sacred human instinct to protect and honor the departed. One elderly resident, Rebecca Lansing, put it simply in a letter to her sister. "We invited wolves into our fold and called them shepherds. We gave them our dead to tend and never questioned when they grew prosperous from such somber work. What does it say about us that such men could dwell among us and go unchallenged?" This sense of communal guilt lingered for generations. Even as the Ashworth story faded from national memory in these quiet Appalachian towns, it became folk legend, a whispered warning passed from parent to child. Be careful who buries your dead. Buried and forgotten, how the Ashworth case vanished from public memory until 1918. Despite the scale of the crimes and the shockwaves they sent through communities, churches, and medical institutions, the Ashworth case began to fade from public view surprisingly quickly. By the time the Civil War erupted just 4 decades later, most Americans, especially those outside of Kentucky, had never heard the name Ashworth, much less grasped the depth of the atrocities committed in Death Valley Cemetery. What had once been the focus of national horror quietly slipped into obscurity, relegated to footnotes in legal archives, regional gossip, and occasional whispers in Appalachian folklore. Why was such a monumental crime so swiftly forgotten? The answer lies in the socio-political climate of 19th century America. The country was rapidly expanding westward. Newspapers turned their attention to gold rushes, wars, industrialization, and Reconstruction. The Ashworth scandal, though once headline-worthy, became inconvenient in light of medicine's growing respectability. Many of the institutions once implicated had undergone leadership changes, rebranding efforts, or had conveniently lost early documentation. Publicizing their past ties to a body-selling murder ring would have undermined their authority at a time when modern medicine was trying to establish itself as legitimate and humane. Victorian sensibilities also played a role. As the 19th century progressed, there was a pronounced cultural shift toward idealizing death. Mourning became ceremonial, even romanticized. The idea of dissecting corpses, especially ones acquired through violence and deceit, clashed with the image of the beautiful death portrayed in literature, art, and spiritual thought. The grotesque details of the Ashworths' operation, sawdust-filled coffins, surgical tools beneath the pulpit, children preserved like cargo, were deemed too horrific for polite conversation. The case became taboo, something spoken of only in hushed tones, if at all. For decades, what remained were fragments, local legends, mistrust of undertakers, strange phrases etched on old tombstones. Occasionally, an academic paper or a county coroner's journal would reference the Ashworth horror, but few pursued it. The ledgers had been turned over to the state, then moved to a historical archive, then gradually forgotten, stored, but unread like the very dead they once catalogued. And so the story of America's most prolific body traders slipped beneath the surface of public awareness, buried just like their victims beneath layers of denial, distraction, and time. That is, until 1918. During routine construction outside of Somerset, Kentucky, workers digging for a new road struck a large metal box. Thinking it was an old storage vault, they forced it open. Inside were 17 leather-bound ledgers. The first 16 were the long-lost originals taken as evidence in 1822. But the 17th, completely unknown until that moment, would reignite a historical firestorm. It contained Ezekiel's final entries, including contingency plans, encoded maps to buried caches of money, and a list of potential safe houses and identities the brothers planned to adopt after their escape. More disturbingly, the last pages offered a twisted philosophical reflection on their crimes. "We have advanced medical knowledge more than any physicians of our era," Ezekiel wrote. "If even one of our subjects trains a surgeon who saves lives, our work will have saved more than it ever destroyed." History must weigh not only what was done, but why and what it achieved. With that rediscovery, the Ashworth story burst back into the world no longer as myth, but as documented history. The ledgers were transferred to the Kentucky Historical Society, where modern researchers began the slow, meticulous process of deciphering codes, matching names, and uncovering truths that had been buried, some quite literally, for over a century. The 1918 rediscovery forced America to once again confront its uncomfortable past. It raised questions about the price of medical progress, the fragility of community trust, and how many other crimes had been buried not just in graveyards, but in forgotten archives, sealed attics, and burned records. Most hauntingly, it asked, if we had not found those ledgers, would we have ever remembered at all? Legacy of the Ledgers, Hidden Fortunes, Disciples of Death, and an Ongoing Mystery. The rediscovery of the 17th ledger in 1918 did more than reopen a closed chapter. It revealed an entire unwritten volume. Unlike the prior 16, which focused primarily on transactions, logistics, and anatomical details, this final book was something else entirely, a blueprint for escape, a philosophical treatise, and a web of connections that suggested the Ashworth brothers had not only fled successfully, but had inspired others to follow in their footsteps. At the heart of this final ledger was Ezekiel's contingency plan, dozens of pages of detailed instructions outlining how the brothers were to disappear, create new identities, and rebuild their enterprise elsewhere. There were references to land titles purchased under assumed names in Missouri Territory, aliases for each brother, and coded letters of introduction to contacts in western Pennsylvania, Arkansas, and southern Illinois. The entries even detailed how to stagger future correspondence so that no two brothers would operate too close together, reducing the chance of discovery. One passage written with disturbing calm reads, "Zachariah will operate independently henceforth. One man raises no suspicion where three might. We maintain connection through established couriers. The work continues. The purpose persists. We adapt as nature does to survive." These were not the words of men in panic. They were the calculations of career criminals with decades of foresight, and more importantly, with a legacy in mind. This legacy became more troubling with the ledger's final section, a list of 7 names and coded references to operators in other rural communities. These individuals, it seems, had corresponded with Ezekiel in the years leading up to 1821, seeking his advice on preservation techniques, corpse transport logistics, and evading scrutiny. In one entry, he writes, "Our methods have created a new industry. I have shared them selectively with those who show proper resolve, discretion, and appreciation for necessity." Modern historians now refer to these individuals as the Disciples of Death, a chilling moniker for what may have been a network of decentralized corpse traffickers inspired and mentored by the Ashworths. Several were never identified. Others, upon further research, appear to have lived suspiciously quiet lives near rail hubs, river routes, or university towns, all locations conducive to discreet body movement and sale. Some researchers have suggested that the unusual anatomical consistency found in specimens across several 19th-century medical schools might be evidence of shared preservation techniques passed down through this shadow network. The ledger also referenced hidden caches of money wealth accumulated over nearly 4 decades of murder for profit. Some locations were detailed through riddles and landmarks, but several remain undeciphered to this day. Treasure hunters, archivists, and historians have long searched eastern Kentucky's forests, creeks, and hills, hoping to uncover the lost Ashworth fortune. One cache was allegedly found near the ruins of the Ashworth home in 1926, containing gold coins, surgical tools, and preserved anatomical notes wrapped in oilcloth. Most, however, remain undiscovered if they exist at all. But perhaps the most haunting mystery left behind is not material. It is the fate of the brothers themselves. Despite nationwide manhunts, newspaper bulletins, and decades of rumor, the Ashworths were never conclusively found. They became the ghosts of the frontier whispered of in Missouri, glimpsed in Tennessee, suspected in Pennsylvania. A preacher with Zachariah's voice and build. An undertaker named Ashfield, whose embalming skills were unnaturally advanced. A gentleman in Arkansas who paid for everything in coin and never let anyone near his cellar. No confirmations, no arrests, just shadows. Today, the 17th ledger remains one of the most important artifacts in the Kentucky Historical Society's archive. It has been digitized, translated, and pored over by legal scholars, anthropologists, and theologians alike. And still it raises more questions than it answers. Did the brothers truly escape and start anew? Did their methods shape medical practices beyond what we can trace? How many of their disciples continued in silence, unseen, but active across the 19th century? And most chilling of all, what if some never stopped? One woman's legacy. Elizabeth Caldwell and the cost of knowing the truth. Among the countless names that appear in the Ashworth ledgers, victims, accomplices, buyers, and ghosts, one name does not: Elizabeth Caldwell. She was never recorded by Ezekiel, never mentioned in their encoded letters, never referenced in the financial tallies or body counts. And yet, it is because of Elizabeth Caldwell that the entire operation unraveled. Without her, James Caldwell's death would have become just another anonymous entry, subject number 623, shipped east with a coded note and a few gold coins. Instead, her unshakable pursuit of truth born out of love and suspicion brought an empire of horror to its knees. After identifying her husband's body in the Ashworth cellar, still wearing the wedding ring she had given him only months earlier, Elizabeth chose not to collapse in grief. Instead, she chose action, standing beside investigators in the weeks that followed, providing testimony names and timelines that helped cross-reference ledger entries with missing persons. She corresponded with the families of other victims, helping them piece together the disappearances of their loved ones. For over 2 years, she worked with officials to publicly expose the network of collusion that had allowed the Ashworth brothers to operate so freely. But her contributions did not end there. Elizabeth used a portion of her late husband's estate, what little remained after legal proceedings, to establish a small school in Lexington, initially dedicated to educating orphaned girls whose families had suffered under frontier violence. Over time, it evolved into one of the most respected academic institutions in the state. She also became a leading advocate for reform in medical education, pushing for laws that would restrict how cadavers could be acquired, and championing ethical transparency in an era still wrestling with moral ambiguity. When she was asked why she stayed in Kentucky, why she didn't leave the haunted land of her trauma behind, she answered simply, because I do not believe in giving evil the last word. Elizabeth never remarried. Her life, by many accounts, was one of solitude and discipline, but it was not a life of bitterness. She redirected her grief into purpose, mentoring young women, writing letters to lawmakers, and occasionally speaking quietly, powerfully about what she had witnessed. She rarely mentioned the brothers by name. When she did, it was only to emphasize the larger lesson: evil often hides behind trust, and the greatest danger to any community is the refusal to question those in power. In 1860, nearly 4 decades after the cellar was unearthed and the town renamed Elizabeth, granted a rare interview to the Louisville Courier. When asked if she felt pride in exposing the Ashworths, her answer was as haunting as it was wise. "I feel no pride, only a deep sadness that my James and hundreds of others were sacrificed on the altar of progress. If there is consolation, it is that their deaths led to change. Reforms were passed, secrets were dragged into the light. That's all I ever wanted for someone else, not to live the lie I did." She died later that year, buried in a modest plot on the outskirts of Lexington beneath a simple stone that reads, "Elizabeth Caldwell." She asked the right question. There are no statues of her. No school bears her name, yet her legacy endures in the very fabric of history, a quiet force of integrity in a world that had forgotten how easily good men could mask evil. In a story full of horrors, Elizabeth Caldwell was the lantern in the dark, the solitary voice that said, "No, I will not accept this silence. I will dig." The price of progress, ethics medicine, and the forgotten cost of scientific advancement. Beneath the horrifying details of the Ashworth case, its calculated murders, coded ledgers, and betrayal of trust, lies a deeper, more unsettling truth. These atrocities were enabled not by madness or chaos, but by progress. The brothers did not sell corpses into the shadows, they sold them to the future, to doctors, to scholars, to institutions that claimed the noble pursuit of science. And it is in this light that their crimes must be understood not only as a breach of morality, but as a mirror reflecting the ethical crisis at the heart of modern medicine's foundations. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, anatomical study was essential. America's medical schools were rising in number and ambition eager to compete with their counterparts in Europe. But anatomy required bodies, and the supply was desperately short. Executed criminals were the only legal source, but executions were few and demand far outstripped availability. In this vacuum, men like the Ashworths became indispensable. They didn't just fill a need, they fulfilled a system's silent wish. Don't tell us where they come from, just deliver them fresh. This complicity forms one of the darkest ironies of the entire story. Many of the physicians and professors who received the Ashworth's specimens went on to save lives, to pioneer treatments, to educate generations of doctors. But their knowledge, so often praised, was built on the backs of people murdered for their bodies. The same medical institutions that elevated their prestige with dissection labs and clinical precision conveniently ignored the origins of their materials. The Ashworths did not operate despite the system they operated because of it. This raises questions that resonate far beyond one historical atrocity. What is the moral cost of advancement? How do societies justify grey market ethics when the outcome is increased knowledge? At what point does the pursuit of science become so urgent that human dignity becomes optional? The Ashworth brothers had their own answer. In Ezekiel's writings, he repeatedly refers to the greater good. "The dead serve the living," he wrote. "If one subject trains a surgeon who saves 10 lives, then that death was righteous. The families do not need to understand. Their pain is brief. The knowledge their loved one provides is eternal." This cold arithmetic echoes eerily in modern debates about medical research, data privacy, and the use of human subjects in experimental treatment. It is easy to relegate the Ashworth case to the past as an isolated horror from a more barbaric time. But the questions it raises are timeless when urgency outweighs regulation, when demand overpowers ethics who becomes expendable. After the 1918 rediscovery of the 17th ledger, medical ethicists across the United States began revisiting historical anatomical practices, and what they found was unsettling. The Ashworths were not the only body traders. Their methods were perhaps the most methodical, but similar operations were uncovered in New York, Maryland, and Georgia, each catering to prestigious institutions, each operating with plausible deniability. Some schools claimed ignorance. Others invoked necessity. In time, tighter laws were passed, stricter oversight introduced. But the fundamental dilemma remained: where do we draw the line between what is useful and what is just? Today, in lecture halls and bioethics seminars, the Ashworth case is occasionally cited not for its sensationalism, but for what it reveals about the fragility of institutional morality. Not all evil is chaotic. Some of it wears white coats, signs, invoices, and praises itself for serving humanity. And while science has moved forward, the echoes of that old cellar beneath Death Valley Cemetery still ring, reminding us that progress, when unmoored from compassion, can quietly pave its roads with the bones of the forgotten. Truth beneath the soil: what the Ashworth story teaches us about memory, trust, and the dark corners of history. More than 2 centuries have passed since the Ashworth brothers fled into obscurity. The woods have regrown. The chapel rotted to its bones and collapsed. The gravestones are worn smooth by rain, wind, and silence. And yet beneath the soil of Ashworth Creek, beneath the floorboards of history itself, something remains. A lesson, a warning, a shadow that refuses to be buried. The story of the Ashworths is not just a tale of betrayal and death. It is a story about what happens when memory is erased, when trust is manipulated, and when entire communities allow the appearance of holiness to blind them to horror. There is a reason this story was nearly lost. For decades it lived only in sealed court records, whispered legends, and decaying ledgers buried in forgotten archives. It challenged too much. It exposed the fragility of rural faith, the hidden hunger of scientific ambition, and the ease with which evil cloaks itself in righteousness. To confront the Ashworth truth was to confront the weakness in human systems, churches, schools, families, even medicine. It was to admit that beneath the rituals of life and death, there are always those who see opportunity in vulnerability. And that's what makes this story timeless. Every generation faces its own version of the Ashworth deception. Today it may not be corpses in cellars, or preachers with ledgers of the dead, but the principle remains. People still trust too easily. Institutions still guard their secrets, and those in power still count on silence more than resistance. Whether it's whistleblowers uncovering corruption, journalists revealing buried truths, or ordinary citizens asking hard questions, history only changes when someone refuses to look away. The Ashworths thrived in a time when truth moved slowly, but even then a woman like Elizabeth Caldwell, armed with nothing but grief and suspicion, tore a hole in their darkness with a single act of defiance. She looked, she asked, she kept digging. That lesson may be the most important of all. In the quiet of Ashworth Creek today, nature has done its best to forget. Ivy climbs the remnants of the workshop walls. Tree roots split open the cemetery path. A few descendants live nearby, distant from the name, unaware or perhaps unwilling to speak it. But sometimes researchers still visit, not for closure, but for clarity, to understand how something so vast, so coldly executed, could hide in plain sight. What they find is not just a crime scene. They find a map of human failure, of systems that collapsed under the weight of convenience, and of good people who wanted so badly to believe the best that they refused to consider the worst. And yet that same soil also holds a seed of resistance. It whispers a truth older than the Ashworth brothers, older than anatomy, older than the lie they sold to the world. No secret stays buried forever. Not when someone dares to ask where the bodies are. So we remember not because we want to dwell in horror, but because history is a lantern and the past is not as far away as it seems.